The sheriff's boat cut across the lake, spraying a white arc of water as blue lights flickered, and the HOA president screamed from the dock with a clipboard raised high, threatening citations and lawsuits, while two men in khaki shorts tried to yank my wooden planks loose with crowbars, and my dog barked so hard the echo bounced off the far cliffs, and I stood barefoot holding a rolled-up deed like a sword, telling them they had exactly 3 seconds to step off before I made the call. That would end their little shoreline empire forever. And that was how the first shot of this insane war started, long before sunrise on that Saturday. The smell of wet cedar mixed with the metallic tang of tension in the air as I tried to steady my breathing, and the sheriff finally cut the engine, gliding into place next to my dock, the hull bumping against the posts I had built with my own hands 10 years earlier, each beam sealed and approved by the county. The HOA president's voice cracked, going from righteous to shrill, as she yelled about bylaws and encroachments, but her eyes flicked nervously at the sheriff's badge, realizing the scene she had engineered to humiliate me might backfire in front of the only man on this lake with real authority. My hands trembled, not with fear but with rage at how they had escalated from letters to threats to now an actual dawn raid on my property. The sheriff raised his hand, the sun glinting off his mirrored sunglasses, and said in a slow drawl that he'd like to hear my side first. That was my cue. I unrolled the deed, held it high enough for the two HOA enforcers to see, and said, "This dock is my land, my water, and my right, and anyone who removes a nail will be charged with trespassing." The sheriff took the paper, glanced at it, and nodded, while the HOA president's face turned the color of wet clay. But this showdown was only the tip of an iceberg that had been forming all summer. 3 weeks earlier I had found a folded notice tucked under my cabin door, an official letterhead from the Lakeside Homeowners Association demanding immediate removal of my dock due to visual obstruction and unauthorized expansion. I had laughed at the phrasing. Visual obstruction? My dock had been here before half their houses. I knew they were trying to flex because their club had been using the adjacent shoreline for their paddleboard meets and fishing tournaments, and my dock inconveniently marked the boundary between my private shore and their unofficial playground. I ignored the first letter, then a second, then a third. Then came the fines, $500 a day supposedly, with threats of liens and lawsuits. I sent back copies of my county permits and the original plat map signed by the judge 20 years ago, highlighting the clear language about riparian rights and permanent dock easements. Their lawyer responded with something snide about interpretation of boundaries. I knew then they were gearing up for something uglier. The night before the showdown, I had been sitting on my porch listening to the frogs and thinking how ridiculous this had become. A group of retirees with clipboards and golf carts acting like a private navy trying to push me off my own water. I wasn't some outsider. My grandfather had built our first pier here in 1965, before the HOA even existed. They had no moral claim, and now they had no legal claim either, but they were still coming. I could see the writing on the wall. So I called the sheriff the evening before and explained calmly that there might be an incident at dawn. He had chuckled and said he'd swing by to keep the peace. That was when I realized they were planning a surprise strike, hoping to rip out my dock before I could stop them. They must have thought a few retired weekend warriors with pry bars could do the job before breakfast. They were dead wrong. As the sheriff stepped onto my dock that morning and handed me back my deed, he said, "Looks pretty clear to me," and turned to the HOA president to ask if she had any legal order authorizing removal. She stammered, tried to produce a printout of their bylaws, but the sheriff cut her off with a raised palm. "This is county jurisdiction," he said flatly. "No county order, no removal." The two men with crowbars froze mid-motion, then sheepishly set the tools down. My dog stopped barking and trotted up to me, tail high, as if sensing the shift. I could feel a ripple of satisfaction running through me, but also a new resolve, because this wasn't over. They'd be back. And next time they'd try something slicker, maybe in court, maybe with the zoning board. I had to get ahead of them. After the sheriff left and the HOA retreated to their pontoon boat in silence, I walked the length of my dock feeling each plank under my feet. 10 years of storms, ice, sun, and countless nights under the stars. This wasn't just wood. This was my line in the sand. The lake was glassy now, disturbed only by the retreating wake of their boat, but I could almost hear the buzz of their emergency meeting brewing already. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. Margaret Pritchard, HOA president, self-styled guardian of the lake. She loved to quote bylaws and wear her little naval cap at the meetings. Her husband ran their so-called Shoreline committee. Together they'd bullied half the residents into repainting their boathouses and replacing their mailboxes with approved models. But I wasn't like the others. I had paperwork, history, and a plan. That afternoon I drove into town and pulled every record from the county clerk's office. Deeds, surveys, permits, and, most interestingly, the original charter of the Lakeside Homeowners Association. In their eagerness to control everything, they had failed to renew a key easement from the 1970s that allowed their club to launch from the spit of land adjoining mine. Without it, technically, their entire clubhouse access to the lake was in legal limbo. I photocopied everything, highlighted the relevant lines, and set it aside like ammunition. If they wanted a war over my dock, I'd give them an eviction notice for their entire operation. I also reached out to an old friend who worked in the zoning department. He confirmed what I suspected. The HOA had no standing to regulate private docks outside their deeded boundary. In fact, several of their rules were unenforceable countywide. My dock wasn't just legal. It was bulletproof. As evening fell that day I could feel the lake changing mood. The frogs and crickets sang louder as if cheering. I grilled some fish and thought about how to play my next move. I could go public, humiliate them at the next meeting, or I could bide my time and hit them with a legal notice when they least expected it. Part of me wanted to just enjoy the summer and let them stew. But another part, the part that remembered being dragged out of bed at dawn to defend what was mine, wanted decisive action. I imagined the look on Margaret's face when a county officer handed her an eviction notice for her precious club dock. I imagined the members showing up to find their access revoked, their buoys pulled, their pontoon boats marooned. I smiled into the dark and listened to the lapping water. They had tried to bully the wrong man. The next morning I woke before sunrise, instinctively alert, and scanned the shoreline. No boats. No flashlights. Just mist rising off the water like a silver curtain. My dock stood proud and untouched, its posts dark against the pale water. My dog stretched beside me, yawning. I poured a coffee and felt a surge of calm. But under that calm burned a bright, clean fire. They would try again, and soon. I would be ready. I ran my fingers over the stack of documents on my kitchen table. I had every weapon I needed, and unlike them, I'd fight fair but hard. The war over my dock had begun, and by the time it ended, the entire Lakeside Homeowners Association would regret ever sending me that first letter. I would evict them not with crowbars or yelling but with the same thing that had built this lake town: ironclad land rights and a refusal to be intimidated. The morning after the showdown the lake looked calm, but under that smooth water everything felt different and electric, like a thunderstorm still rumbling far off but hidden by the hills, and I felt a mix of triumph and unease as I walked my dock with a mug of coffee, thinking about how many eyes were on me from the big windows of the HOA houses lining the opposite shore, and imagining Margaret Pritchard clutching her phone pacing her deck as she called an emergency meeting of her committee to discuss how to retaliate. The sheriff's intervention had humiliated them, but humiliation was gasoline to Margaret's ego, and I knew she would double down now that she had been publicly contradicted. All day I kept getting calls from neighbors pretending to check on me but really fishing for gossip about what had happened at dawn. One of them whispered that the HOA group chat was on fire with outrage and frantic legal talk. Another mentioned seeing two unfamiliar cars at Margaret's driveway, which meant she had already summoned their lawyer and some hired muscle for the next move. I thanked each neighbor politely and told them nothing, keeping my cards close. My dog sensed my tension and paced the shoreline, sniffing the damp sand where the HOA men had stood with their crowbars. Their footprints had already faded, but the memory was fresh and stung like a splinter under the skin. I walked up to my cabin porch and looked out over the lake, picturing the whole chessboard of what they might do next and feeling the thrill of anticipation at beating them at their own game. That afternoon I loaded the truck with my evidence folder and drove to the county zoning office to meet with my friend Jake, who had been working there for 15 years and knew every loophole, boundary, and forgotten regulation in the area. He greeted me with a grin because he had already heard the gossip, but he kept it professional, leading me into the back office lined with rolled-up survey maps. We spread my documents out on the table and he ran his finger over the old plat maps like a doctor reading x-rays. He confirmed what I already knew but added a twist I hadn't caught. The HOA's claim to the spit of land for their club activities had expired quietly 3 years ago because they failed to renew their community lease with the County Parks Department. Without that lease, their access to the lake beyond their individual properties was legally void. That meant their dock, their boat ramp, even their storage sheds were technically on unpermitted ground. I felt a slow grin spread across my face as Jake explained it. Not only was my dock secure, but their entire operation sat on a legal time bomb they hadn't noticed. I told Jake to make me certified copies of everything and to stamp them with the county seal. He chuckled and said he'd rush it for me. As he handed over the first batch of stamped documents, he lowered his voice and said, "If you're smart, you'll let them hang themselves before you pull the pin. Let them put something in writing, then deliver the hammer." I nodded because that was exactly my style. On the way back I stopped at the general store where locals gathered by the coffee urn and pretended not to talk politics. When I walked in, the conversation hushed and then resumed in a low buzz. People knew about the dock battle and their eyes sparkled with curiosity. Some slipped me quiet words of support, others warned me to be careful because Margaret had friends on the county board. I smiled and thanked them all, keeping my plan hidden like a poker hand. Outside in the parking lot I saw a white SUV with the HOA logo parked at the edge, 2 men inside watching me over the top of a legal pad. They looked like private investigators but probably were just overzealous volunteers. I tipped my hat and drove away slowly, making sure they saw the calm confidence on my face. Back at the cabin I filed my new documents in a metal lockbox and poured myself a stiff drink while the sun slanted across the water in amber bars. My dog lay at my feet gnawing a stick as if it were a crowbar, and I chuckled at the image. That evening my phone buzzed with a mass email from the HOA announcing a special emergency session scheduled for the following Saturday at the clubhouse to discuss unauthorized shoreline activities. The phrasing made me laugh because it was so obviously about me, but they couldn't even say my name. I pictured Margaret writing it with clenched teeth, adding passive-aggressive quotation marks. I clicked open the attached agenda and saw they planned to vote on mandatory relocation of my dock and on revoking communal privileges for non-compliant members. It was absurd because they had no authority over my property, but the very fact they were putting it in writing played into my hands. If they voted on it and recorded minutes, it would be official evidence of them exceeding their jurisdiction. I poured another drink and whispered to my dog that the trap was almost set. The next few days I kept a low profile but moved like a ghost, gathering more ammunition. I found an old newspaper article about my grandfather's dedication of the original dock decades ago with the county commissioner in attendance. I scanned it and added it to the file. I also went down to the marina and spoke to the old harbormaster who had seen the whole evolution of the lake community. He confirmed that my family's dock rights predated the HOA by decades, and he agreed to testify if it came to a legal fight. As I built this fortress of evidence, I felt an almost surgical calm settle over me. They had tried to rattle me with noise and confrontation, but I would end them with quiet precision and the weight of history. On Thursday evening, as the sun dipped, I noticed Margaret's pontoon boat drifting slowly past my dock. She wore her naval cap and oversized sunglasses and pretended to be on a casual ride, but she kept glancing at my property with a pinched expression. I waved politely and she did not wave back. My dog barked once, deep and resonant, and she jolted, then motored away. That small encounter told me everything. She was rattled but still scheming. She thought her meeting would corner me, that the HOA vote would somehow pressure me to cave. I smiled because Saturday was coming and with it my counterstrike. Friday night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the end of the dock under the stars thinking about my grandfather and the summers I'd spent diving off this same platform as a kid, the smell of pine and gasoline from the old outboard motor, the way the lake had always been our refuge. I wasn't just defending a piece of wood. I was defending a legacy. Around midnight an idea bloomed in my head so clear it felt like a flash of lightning. Instead of waiting for them to try and evict me at the meeting, I would show up first with a prepared eviction notice of my own. I would hand it to Margaret in front of her whole committee and watch the color drain from her face as she realized the club had been squatting on county land without a lease. It would be legal, public, and devastating. The thought calmed me enough to sleep at last. When I drove back from the clubhouse after delivering the eviction notice, the lake looked almost unreal in its stillness, like a giant pane of dark glass, and for a moment I wondered if I had pushed too hard too fast, but then I saw the familiar shape of my dock stretching into the water and felt the old steadiness return, the sense that this was mine and I was finally fighting back on my own terms. My phone buzzed non-stop on the passenger seat with messages from neighbors and even a few committee members who had slipped out early, some thanking me quietly, others warning me that Margaret was already calling an emergency legal team. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I rolled the windows down and let the cold wind slap my face as I thought through my next move. In one stroke I had broken their illusion of authority, but I knew Margaret's pride wouldn't let her retreat without a counterattack. She had been embarrassed before dozens of people, and I had undermined her carefully built persona as the queen of the shoreline. Humiliation like that can turn to desperation, and desperation can make people reckless. Back at the cabin, my dog bounded to the truck, wagging his tail, sensing the adrenaline still running through me. We walked together down the dock and sat at the end watching the sun glint off the water. In my mind I replayed the look on Margaret's face when her own vice president showed her the expired lease on his phone. Her lips had trembled as if she might cry or explode. That was the moment I had been waiting for, the crack in her armor. But cracks can lead to collapse or to dangerous lashouts. I knew she still had allies on the county board and she might try to use them. I also knew from experience that a wounded bureaucrat can become creative with paperwork, searching for loopholes or technicalities to harass someone. I couldn't rest yet. I had to stay 3 steps ahead, keep my evidence ready, and anticipate her moves like a chess player. That evening the sky turned a molten copper and I grilled dinner on the porch, trying to let the tension melt out of my shoulders. As darkness fell across the lake, I saw the faint glow of the clubhouse windows on the far shore, flickering like a watchtower. I imagined Margaret in there with her committee, trying to spin the narrative, looking for a way to claw back control. My phone pinged again with an email from an address I didn't recognize, subject line cease and desist. I opened it and found a poorly drafted threat from a law office claiming I was slandering the HOA and illegally evicting them. It was full of bluster but empty of substance. I saved it and printed a copy for my growing file, smiling grimly as I did. They were moving fast but not smart. This was the point where they could either negotiate or self-destruct. Knowing Margaret, it would be the latter. The next morning I went into town early to meet Jake at the zoning office again. He had more news. Overnight he had dug deeper and found not only the expired lease but also evidence that the HOA had been collecting shoreline maintenance fees from residents for years without legal authority. If that came out, it could be a scandal. Jake suggested I keep that information as a last resort card, a nuke I could drop if they tried to take me to court. I thanked him and promised to use it wisely. As we talked he leaned closer and said he had heard rumors of the HOA trying to push a new emergency ordinance through the county board to retroactively authorize their access. That made me laugh because it was legally impossible without my consent, but it showed how frantic they were. I left his office feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and vigilance, like a soldier cleaning his weapon after a skirmish knowing another battle loomed. Back at the cabin I started documenting everything in a bound notebook. Dates, times, witnesses, copies of emails. My grandfather had taught me to keep meticulous records when dealing with officials, and it had saved our family more than once. As I wrote I realized how much of my life on this lake was tied up with this fight now, how personal it had become. Yet I also felt strangely alive, as if the confrontation had woken me up from a long sleep. The dock had become a symbol of more than just property. It was proof that you could still stand up to creeping overreach and win if you had the patience and paperwork. My dog lay on the rug watching me with half-closed eyes as if he understood the stakes. Later that day I decided to take a kayak out along the shoreline, partly to clear my head, partly to see what the HOA was up to. As I glided past the boundary marker between my property and theirs, I noticed something interesting. Their so-called communal dock was half empty, buoys pulled up, and a handwritten sign taped to a post reading "Closed pending review." That told me my eviction notice had already spooked them into retreating. I paddled on, circling the small cove where they used to store paddleboards. Empty. Only a couple of folding chairs remained, blowing in the wind. I felt a surge of triumph but tempered it with caution. A retreat can be a prelude to a counterstrike. That night as I sat on the porch the phone rang. It was an older resident named Bill who had always been polite but never friendly before. He said he had been at the meeting and wanted me to know not everyone supported Margaret. In fact, he said, a lot of people were tired of her power games and might be willing to vote her out if an opportunity arose. He even hinted that some board members were considering dissolving the HOA's Shoreline committee entirely to avoid further embarrassment. I thanked him for the information and told him I just wanted to be left alone. After we hung up, I thought about how quickly power shifts when people sense weakness. Margaret had ruled through intimidation and now she was hemorrhaging authority. That made her more dangerous but also more isolated. On Wednesday a certified letter arrived at my cabin. I opened it and found a formal notice from the HOA demanding that I attend a mediation to resolve the dock dispute. It was written in stiff legalese and threatened arbitration if I refused. I laughed out loud. They were still pretending they had a dispute to mediate when in fact I had already won. I put the letter aside and began drafting a response through my lawyer friend in town, stating clearly that there was no jurisdiction and that any further harassment would be reported to the county. My friend agreed to send it on letterhead to give it more weight. As I sealed the envelope, I felt another wave of calm settle over me. They were fighting on my terms now. That evening a thunderstorm rolled over the hills, rain drumming on the roof and lightning flickering across the lake. I stood at the window watching the dock sway slightly under the wind and thought about all the storms it had survived before. Nature had tested it harder than any HOA ever could. In the flashes of lightning I could see the opposite shore, the clubhouse dark and silent like a fortress with its lights snuffed out. The storm felt cleansing, washing away some of the tension, leaving only resolve. By Friday the storm had passed and news traveled fast around the lake. Someone leaked the expired lease story to a local blog and now the HOA's misstep was public. The headline read, "Lakeside HOA loses legal right to Club Shoreline," and the comments were brutal. Residents mocked Margaret's leadership and demanded refunds of their maintenance fees. When I read it I felt a pang of sympathy despite everything. It's a hard thing to watch a small empire crumble. But then I remembered the dawn raid on my dock and the crowbars in strangers' hands and the sympathy evaporated. They had chosen this fight, not me. That night as the sun set blood-red over the water I sat at the end of my dock with my dog and imagined the future. Soon the HOA would be forced to pull back, maybe even dismantle their dock and storage. Without their physical foothold on the water their power would shrink to what it should have been all along, a neighborhood club with no control over private property. I pictured Margaret resigning or being voted out, new leadership rising, and the lake returning to a calmer rhythm. Yet part of me also knew the story wasn't over. Power vacuums attract opportunists and a wounded board might try one last desperate maneuver before surrendering. I decided to be ready for anything. That weekend I began quietly reaching out to sympathetic residents, not to form a countergroup but to explain the facts and ease tensions. I invited a few over for coffee on the porch, showed them the documents, and reassured them that I wasn't trying to ruin the community, only to protect my rights. Many left looking relieved, promising to spread the word. Each conversation chipped away at the narrative Margaret had built about me as some rogue property owner. By the time Sunday rolled around I could feel the tide turning completely. Late Sunday night, as mist curled off the lake under a full moon, my dog lifted his head and growled softly. I stepped outside and saw a figure at the edge of my property, a silhouette holding something long and thin. My pulse jumped but I stayed calm. I called out a greeting and the figure bolted into the trees. I found only a dropped clipboard with HOA letterhead lying in the grass. It smelled faintly of gasoline. I carried it inside, locked the door, and sat at the table thinking. They were rattled enough to send someone skulking at night. That was either desperation or a bluff. Either way, it was a sign the final act was approaching. I patted my dog's head and told him we'd outlast them no matter what. In the dark cabin surrounded by the smell of pine and lake water, I felt the deep, slow burn of resolve harden like steel. The morning after finding that clipboard in the grass, I woke before dawn and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fog lift off the water and feeling the heavy quiet of the lake like a warning held between heartbeats, and I knew without anyone telling me that Margaret and her allies had moved past paperwork into something darker, that if they couldn't beat me with bylaws they would try to scare me or catch me off guard. My dog lay at my feet with his ears flicking toward the tree line, and every so often he gave a low growl, not loud enough to echo but deep enough to vibrate the boards. I had spent the previous evening double-checking every lock, every camera, every motion light around the cabin. This was no longer just a dispute over a dock. This was the kind of standoff where one mistake could cost everything. Yet instead of fear I felt an odd calm, like a captain in rough seas. The fight had become pure now, stripped of pretense. They wanted my dock and control over the shoreline. I wanted my freedom and my legacy. Everything else was noise. I drove into town and met Jake again to update him about the nighttime visitor. He frowned and said he wasn't surprised. He had heard whispers that Margaret had hired a private security consultant to advise the board. I laughed and asked what a security consultant could do about a legal eviction. He said sometimes these people use intimidation tactics hoping to provoke a reaction that can be spun as aggression. He advised me to stay calm, keep recording everything, and if necessary file a trespass complaint. I promised him I would. Then he surprised me by handing me another folder. Inside were more documents he had dug up showing not only had the HOA lost its lease but that a small sliver of land they thought they owned was actually county property used as public access. Without that sliver their entire dock was landlocked from the parking lot. It was like watching a sandcastle crumble tide by tide. I thanked him again, paid for his lunch, and told him to keep digging. Back at the cabin I decided to take the offensive quietly. I called my lawyer friend in town and explained the trespassing incident. He said he could draft a formal warning letter to the HOA board making it clear that any further harassment or night visits would be considered criminal trespass and would be prosecuted. I told him to do it. While he worked on that I went over my file again, making sure every piece of evidence was backed up in multiple places, scanned, emailed to myself, and locked in a fireproof box. My grandfather had always said never fight on one front. Always keep reserves. By mid-afternoon the sun broke through the fog and sparkled on the lake, and I felt a surge of confidence. They were trying to unsettle me, but instead they had strengthened my resolve. That evening I took the boat out with my dog sitting at the bow, the water calm as glass, and glided past the HOA's shoreline. Their communal dock looked like a ghost town now, tape fluttering from posts, boats pulled away, boys stacked like forgotten toys. The clubhouse blinds were drawn though I saw silhouettes moving inside. As I passed I raised my hand in a friendly wave but nobody waved back. The emptiness of their dock gave me an odd satisfaction but also a strange sadness. This was supposed to be a shared lake, not a battleground. But they had chosen confrontation over coexistence and now they were losing. The next morning a certified letter arrived. It was an official notice from the HOA's lawyer announcing that they had filed for an injunction against me to stop the eviction and to compel me to move my dock pending a hearing. I read it carefully. It was full of citations to their bylaws but not a single reference to county statutes. They were still trying to fight with paper swords. I called my lawyer friend, forwarded him the letter, and we spent an hour on the phone crafting a response. He assured me no judge would grant an injunction on property the HOA didn't own. In fact, he said, their filing would allow us to countersue for harassment and legal costs. I liked that idea. Later that day a neighbor named Susan stopped by unannounced. She was one of the quieter residents, always tending her garden, never speaking at meetings. She looked nervous as she handed me a manila envelope. Inside were copies of internal emails from the HOA board that she had printed out in secret. They showed Margaret instructing members to apply pressure on me through non-official channels and even suggesting using nighttime inspections to document violations. My hands trembled as I read the phrases. This was my smoking gun. It proved the trespass attempt wasn't random. I thanked Susan and promised to protect her identity. She left quickly, glancing over her shoulder. I added her documents to my file and felt the weight of certainty. Margaret had crossed the line from bureaucratic nuisance to orchestrated harassment. That night I barely slept. I sat on the porch with the dog at my feet and a thermos of coffee at my elbow, scanning the tree line for movement. Around midnight I heard an engine on the far shore and saw the glint of flashlights near the clubhouse. I watched through binoculars as a small group loaded boxes into a van. It looked like they were clearing out files. Maybe they had realized their emails had leaked. I noted the time and details in my notebook. If they were destroying evidence, it would only hurt them later. The following morning I drove straight to the county sheriff's office with my growing stack of documents. He greeted me with a knowing smile and invited me into his office. I laid out the trespass incident, the leaked emails, the expired lease, and the injunction letter. He whistled low and said he had suspected as much. He promised to put extra patrols around my property and to assign a deputy to check in during the nights. Then he leaned forward and said quietly that if I wanted to press charges for harassment or attempted intimidation, he would support me. I told him I'd hold off for now but thanked him for the protection. Walking out of his office, I felt like the ground had shifted under Margaret's feet. She had tried to weaponize the system, but now the system was looking at her. Back at the cabin the lake was calm again, but now I saw it as a stage set for the next act. I spent the afternoon repairing a loose railing on my dock, sanding it smooth, staining it until it gleamed. The physical work soothed me. My dog watched the water intently as if expecting more visitors. As the sun went down I received a text from an unknown number reading simply, "This isn't over." I showed it to my lawyer who advised me to screenshot it and file it. I did, adding it to the growing evidence of harassment. On Friday morning I got word from Jake that the county had scheduled an inspection of the HOA's facilities in light of my complaint and the expired lease. They would be sending officials the following week. That was the break I needed. Once the county documented their violations, it would be nearly impossible for Margaret to recover. I spent the rest of the day preparing a packet for the inspectors with all the maps, photos, and legal references. I wanted them to see the full picture. Saturday dawned with a strange quiet over the lake. No boats, no kids playing on the shore, just mist and stillness. I took my coffee out to the dock and sat with my dog, watching the opposite shoreline. A single car was parked at the clubhouse. I saw Margaret's figure on the balcony, still in her naval cap, staring at my property. We looked at each other across the water for a long moment. Then she turned and went inside. It felt like the final scene before a verdict. That evening I invited a few supportive neighbors over for a small barbecue. We ate on the porch, laughed, and talked about the old days before the HOA had gotten so aggressive. Several said they were planning to call for a vote of no confidence in Margaret at the next official meeting. Others offered to testify on my behalf if things went to court. The camaraderie felt good, like the lake community I remembered as a child. As darkness fell and my guests left, I stood at the end of the dock feeling a new strength rising in me. I had allies now. Later that night as the moon rose I heard a splash near the shoreline and grabbed a flashlight. It was only a beaver sliding into the water, but for a moment my heart raced. I realized how on edge I had become. But underneath the tension there was also a sense of inevitability. Margaret had overreached and now the walls were closing in. I turned off the flashlight, sat down on the dock, and let the moonlight wash over me. The water lapped softly against the posts like a slow heartbeat. My dog rested his head on my knee. I whispered to him that soon it would be over, that soon the lake would belong to itself again, free of petty empires. The fight for my dock had become the fight for something larger, a principle as old as the water under me. And in that quiet night, surrounded by the smell of pine and lake water, I felt not just ready but certain of the outcome that was rushing toward us like a slow, unstoppable tide. The county inspection team arrived just after sunrise on Monday in 2 white trucks with the county seal stenciled on the doors and clipboards bristling with forms, and as I watched from my porch I saw the HOA clubhouse across the lake stir like an anthill kicked open, figures darting out to greet the inspectors, Margaret at the front in her navy cap trying to look calm but her gestures sharp and jerky, her voice rising even across the water as she attempted to control the narrative before it even started. I stayed on my porch with my coffee and my dog at my feet, making no move to interfere, knowing that everything that needed to happen was already in motion. The inspectors split into 2 teams, one moving along the shoreline measuring and photographing, the other moving inside the clubhouse to examine permits, leases, and storage areas. I could hear Margaret's voice pitch higher and higher as they questioned her about the expired lease. My dog gave a low chuff of satisfaction and lay his head on my foot. The air smelled of wet pine and something electric like a summer storm about to break, though the sky was perfectly clear. By mid-morning I saw one inspector point to the HOA's dock and shake his head. Another wrote something on a pad and then took more photos. Margaret's gestures grew frantic. At one point she looked across the lake straight at me through her sunglasses as if she could pierce the distance. I lifted my coffee mug in a silent toast. Around noon the inspectors departed without speaking to me, but I knew from their body language that the visit had gone badly for the HOA. Sure enough, 2 hours later my lawyer friend called to say the county had issued a preliminary notice of violation to the HOA and would likely order them to suspend all operations on the shoreline until compliance could be verified. It was the news I had been waiting for, but it landed with a strange quiet satisfaction instead of a shout of victory. I walked down my dock, knelt, and trailed my hand in the cold water, thinking of my grandfather and how he would have smiled to see the paperwork win over bluster. That evening the lake community buzzed with gossip. Neighbors texted me screenshots of the HOA's internal chat exploding with panic, some calling for Margaret's resignation, others threatening lawsuits against the board for mismanagement. It was the first real crack in the wall of fear Margaret had built. People who had been silent for years were suddenly speaking up, questioning the fines they had paid, asking where the money had gone. I read the messages slowly, savoring the shift. Yet I also knew Margaret would not go down quietly. She had built her identity on being in charge. Stripped of that, she might lash out in unpredictable ways. The next morning a storm rolled in from the west, gray sheets of rain marching across the lake and wind whipping the trees into a hiss. I spent the day inside the cabin, tightening my evidence files, writing a timeline of every incident for my lawyer, and thinking through my endgame. My plan was to let the county's process finish and then, if necessary, press charges for harassment based on the trespass and the leaked emails. But another idea was forming at the back of my mind, something more public and undeniable that would leave no room for spin. As thunder rolled overhead I imagined calling a press conference on the dock itself, holding up the expired lease, the emails, and the county violation notice while cameras rolled. The thought made me smile, but I kept it as a card to play later. That night as the rain drummed on the roof my dog lifted his head and growled. I went to the window and saw a lone figure standing at the edge of my property holding an umbrella, unmoving. I couldn't see a face in the dark, but I knew who it was. I opened the door and called out asking what they wanted. The figure turned and walked away without a word. I watched until they disappeared into the trees. The next morning I found a plastic bag tied to my mailbox containing a typed note, "Stop before someone gets hurt." No signature. No logo. Just those words. I added it to the file and called the sheriff, who promised to send a deputy by that evening. The intimidation was clumsy but real. By Wednesday the rain cleared and the lake shone under a hard blue sky. The HOA dock stood empty now, yellow tape fluttering like warning flags. I saw Margaret pacing the clubhouse balcony on her phone, no naval cap this time, hair loose and wild in the wind. Her empire was crumbling in real time. That afternoon my lawyer called again with an update. The county had officially suspended the HOA's access to the shoreline pending a full hearing and had cited them for unpermitted structures. He said it was essentially an eviction notice. I sat on the porch with the phone pressed to my ear and felt a deep quiet spread through me. The thing I had envisioned weeks ago was happening step by step. That evening neighbors began stopping by, some bringing pies or bottles of wine, others just offering thanks. They spoke in low voices about how relieved they were, how oppressive the HOA had been, how much they wanted things to return to normal. I listened and nodded, not gloating, just steady. One old man shook my hand and said he had been waiting 30 years for someone to stand up to them. I felt a lump in my throat at that. This fight had never been just mine. It belonged to everyone who had been quietly bullied into compliance. As the week rolled on, Margaret tried one last maneuver. She sent out a mass email claiming that the county action was temporary and that residents should continue paying fees and obeying the Shoreline rules. But within hours someone replied all with the county's violation notice attached, and her bluff collapsed. More residents demanded an emergency vote to remove her. Others threatened to sue for refunds. The board fractured. I watched from the sidelines as her power evaporated like mist under sunlight. Late Friday night, unable to sleep, I walked down to the dock with my dog. The moon hung low and golden over the water, the lake calm as a sleeping giant. I thought about the arc of the last few weeks, from the dawn raid with crowbars to this quiet night of approaching victory. I realized I no longer felt just defiance. I felt a kind of guardianship over the lake itself, as if standing up to the HOA had been an act of protecting something older and larger than any of us. The boards of the dock creaked softly under my feet and the water lapped like a slow heartbeat. My dog leaned against my leg. Saturday dawned bright and cool with a hint of autumn in the air. I brewed coffee and sat on the porch watching the first light hit the HOA's empty dock. It looked abandoned now, just a skeleton of wood and rope, a monument to overreach. My phone buzzed with a message from Jake, hearing set for next week. County likely to revoke HOA permits permanently. I read it twice, then put the phone down and stared at the water. After all the noise and bluster, it would end in a simple administrative act, a stamp on a piece of paper. That was how real power worked. That afternoon I took the boat out to the center of the lake and cut the engine, letting the wind push me slowly. From that vantage point I could see everything, the pine-lined shores, the scattered cabins, the deflated clubhouse. I thought about my grandfather again and the summers the first had swum here as a boy. I thought about all the people who would now be free to enjoy the lake without fear of fines or petty surveillance. I also thought about Margaret sitting alone in her crumbling fortress, her plans turned to ash. I felt no triumph, only inevitability. That night a small group of residents gathered at my cabin for a quiet celebration. We sat by a fire pit under the stars, telling stories, sipping beer. Some laughed, some cried, everyone feeling the tension drain away. One woman said she planned to rebuild her boathouse the way she always wanted now that the HOA couldn't dictate the color. Another said he was going to stop paying the pointless maintenance fees. It was like watching people wake from a long bad dream. I said little, just listened, knowing the real work was almost done but not yet complete. After they left I stood alone on the dock one last time that night, looking across at the dark clubhouse. A single light burned in an upstairs window. I imagined Margaret inside surrounded by boxes of files, perhaps writing a final appeal, perhaps plotting some last desperate move. I knew she still had a few days before the hearing, a few days to try something bold. But standing there with the moon reflecting off the water I felt unshakable. My position was ironclad, my evidence overwhelming, my allies growing by the day. The lake was with me now, and the slow steady tide of justice was rolling inexorably toward shore. The morning after the county's decision the lake glowed under a pale gold sunrise, the air crisp and cool, and as I walked down the length of my dock with a mug of coffee I felt the kind of deep quiet satisfaction that comes only when a long struggle has finally shifted from uncertainty to resolution, yet beneath that satisfaction was a new sense of anticipation because now, for the first time in weeks, the path ahead was mine to shape rather than just defend. My dog bounded along beside me sniffing the wet boards and giving an occasional happy bark. Across the water the HOA's dock still hung in limbo with yellow tape fluttering and a county notice stapled to one of its posts, and beyond that the clubhouse looked shuttered, blinds drawn, a single car parked out front. It was almost hard to believe this was the same place from which Margaret and her committee had launched dawn raids and sent me threatening letters. The whole scene felt like a stage after a play had ended, props still standing but actors gone. I spent that morning walking the shoreline with a notebook, jotting down ideas for how to help restore some sense of community after the dust settled. Neighbors had been texting me nonstop, asking what came next, wondering if the HOA would dissolve entirely or reinvent itself under new leadership. My instinct was to step back and let the residents themselves decide, but I also saw an opportunity to replace fear with something cooperative, perhaps a volunteer lake committee focused on cleanups and social events instead of punishments. Yet before any rebuilding could happen, the old structures had to be dismantled, literally and figuratively. In 60 days the HOA was supposed to vacate and remove its dock and storage sheds. I knew Margaret might still try to delay or appeal, but the county's enforcement was clear and firm. That afternoon Jake drove out to the cabin with a grin on his face and a bottle of soda to celebrate. He had just received the county's official removal schedule for the HOA structures. He told me inspectors would be back in 2 weeks to oversee the first phase of dismantling and that residents were already signing a petition to call a vote on dissolving the current board. We sat on the porch talking about how quickly the power dynamics had flipped. He said he had never seen such a sudden collapse of an HOA's authority in all his years at zoning. We both laughed at the memory of Margaret quoting bylaws at the inspectors while they measured her unpermitted dock. My dog lay at our feet chewing a stick, tail thumping. But as dusk settled, Jake grew serious and said he had heard Margaret was still trying to rally a few die-hard supporters to file a last-minute injunction or to smear me publicly as some kind of troublemaker. I shrugged and said let her try, the paper trail was on my side. Still, a flicker of caution lit in my mind. Wounded leaders sometimes attempt dramatic gestures to save face. I decided to keep my cameras running, keep the sheriff updated, and not let my guard down completely until the 60 days passed and the HOA's dock was gone. Over the next week the lake community changed like a thawing river. People I barely knew started waving when I passed by boat. Families began fishing again near the boundary line, no longer worried about being scolded for trespassing. Children splashed from their own little piers without fear of fines for unauthorized swimming. The sense of liberation was tangible. One evening a group of teenagers paddled over to thank me for saving summer, and I laughed but also felt a pang at how deeply the HOA's control had seeped into everyday life. This wasn't just about one dock. It was about the right to breathe free on your own water. Meanwhile Margaret's power crumbled further. She sent out one last furious email claiming the county decision was temporary and urging residents to contribute to a legal defense fund, but hardly anyone responded. A neighbor forwarded me the message and I could almost hear the desperation between the lines. Soon after, 2 board members resigned publicly, citing ethical concerns. Another sent me a quiet text apologizing for going along with Margaret's campaign against me. Each defection felt like another brick falling from a collapsing wall. 2 weeks later the county trucks returned with a small crew and began dismantling the HOA's dock under the inspector's supervision. I watched from my porch as they unbolted planks, stacked buoys, and hauled away storage boxes. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Only a few sullen volunteers stood by, arms crossed. By afternoon the dock was half gone, the water shimmering empty where it had been. The sight stirred a complex mix in me. Satisfaction, yes, but also a melancholy at how a structure built to bring people together had become a symbol of overreach and had to be torn down. Yet as the crews worked the air felt lighter, as if the lake itself approved. That evening a spontaneous gathering formed at my cabin. Neighbors brought food and drinks, setting up tables on the shore. Someone lit a bonfire. Children roasted marshmallows. Adults laughed and traded stories about the bad old days of HOA fines and inspections. One man joked about starting a dock appreciation society just to spite Margaret. I stood back from the fire for a while watching the flames reflect on the water, thinking how the lake community was remaking itself in real time without committees or rules, just neighbors enjoying freedom. It was everything I had hoped for during those long nights documenting evidence. As night deepened, a few of the older residents asked me to speak. I hesitated, not wanting to become a new authority figure, but finally I stepped forward and said in a quiet voice that the real victory wasn't mine alone but belonged to everyone who refused to be intimidated, that the lake didn't need overlords, it needed caretakers, and that each person could choose what kind of neighbor they wanted to be. The fire crackled, people nodded, and someone started clapping softly. It wasn't a speech so much as a release of tension, a collective exhale. Afterward, music played from a portable speaker and people danced barefoot on the sand while the water lapped at the shore. Around midnight, as the party wound down and the last neighbors drifted home in their boats, I sat at the end of my dock with my dog and looked across at the darkened clubhouse. The HOA's dock was a skeleton now, half dismantled. The clubhouse windows were black except for one faint light upstairs. I thought of Margaret, perhaps sitting there surrounded by boxes of paperwork, realizing the empire she had built on fear had dissolved into nothing. I felt no desire to gloat. Instead, I felt a calm compassion for a neighbor who had lost her way. But I also knew she had chosen this path, and that accountability was part of living in a community. Over the next days, county crews continued removing the last traces of the HOA's shoreline presence. Each morning I would drink coffee on the porch and watch another section vanish until only open water remained. The sense of liberation was almost physical. My own dock seemed to stretch further into the lake than before, though of course it hadn't moved an inch. I began sketching plans for adding a small gazebo at the end, something my grandfather had always dreamed of but never built. The idea of building, not fighting, filled me with quiet excitement. Yet even as the visible conflict faded, I stayed alert. My cameras stayed running, my files backed up. I knew human nature too well to assume there would be no more surprises. But with each passing day the tension ebbed and the lake's natural rhythm returned. Geese settled on the water again. Fish jumped at dusk. The air smelled of pine and not of fear. It felt like living in color after months of grayscale. By the time the 60 days ended, the HOA's dock was completely gone, the shoreline restored to a natural curve of sand and reeds. The county posted a final notice declaring the area closed until further decision. Neighbors celebrated quietly in their own ways. Some repainted their houses in colors they actually liked. Others built small decks or fixed up old boats. The mood of the community shifted from suspicion to creativity. And through it all my dock remained, steady and unchallenged, a symbol of persistence. On the last night of the 60-day period I threw one more gathering at my cabin, smaller than the bonfire but more intentional. We cooked fish and vegetables, shared wine, and sat watching the stars bloom over the lake. People spoke about forming a new kind of community association, one based on voluntary participation and actual service rather than fines and control. Others said they preferred no organization at all. I listened, smiling, knowing that whatever they chose it would be their choice, not Margaret's, not mine. As the evening wound down and the guests left, I walked once more to the end of the dock. My dog sat beside me, ears pricked toward the far shore. The clubhouse was dark now, truly abandoned, windows empty like eye sockets. The water reflected the stars in 1,000 pinpoints. I thought of everything that had happened from the first dawn raid to this quiet night. It had been a war fought with paper, patience, and persistence, a war of endurance rather than firepower. And in the end endurance had won. Standing there with the night air cool on my face, I felt a shift inside me. The fight was over, but something larger had begun. I no longer thought of myself only as a property owner defending a dock. I thought of myself as a steward of a place, a guardian of a tradition of standing firm. I realized that the real victory was not in evicting the HOA but in showing the whole community that authority only holds if people consent to it blindly. The moment someone shines a light, the spell breaks. My dog leaned against my leg, and I rested my hand on his head. In the distance a loon called, its mournful cry echoing across the water like a benediction. I took a deep breath of pine and cool lake air and felt the weight of the past weeks slip off my shoulders. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight the lake was free, and so was I. and as I turned back toward the cabin with the stars above and the water at my feet, I felt certain that this chapter of my life, like the dock itself, would endure long after the HOA's yellow tape had turned to dust.